The global insurance industry is more than a market.
It's a movement powered by 3 million professionals around the world.
Together, we support communities as they rebuild after disaster.
Help businesses through risk and uncertainty.
Protect individuals as they plan for brighter futures.
This impact isn't possible without people.
That's why we attract, grow, and retain the very best talent.
Because when every voice is heard,
When every person feels they belong.
We don't just build careers.
We build a better tomorrow.
Belonging builds 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 tomorrow.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session where we will be talking about what's happening in Europe in the field of pay equity and pay transparency ahead of the European Commission's new Pay Transparency Directive, which deadline is in 2026. So with the help of our guest speakers, we will try to learn how this is impacting companies, on how they address the topic, which are the challenges, the opportunities, what it will mean for employees, regulations, and hopefully we will get to listen a little bit about market data and trends, what is happening in the market right now. My name is Eugenia Nasser. I'm the Client Solutions Leader for EMEA at Mercer, and we will be able to go through all these interesting topics with the help of our fantastic guest speakers. I will ask them to introduce a little bit themselves, but I will say their roles. We have Sarah Hentos, Global Head of Employment Litigation at A&O Sherman. Hi, Sarah, welcome.
Hi there, thank you for having me.
And we also have Lucy Provera, Fair Pay Leader, Europe and UK at Mercer. Hi, Lucy.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. And yes, thank you for having me in on this exciting conversation.
Super. Thanks for being with us. And we would like to hear from you that are listening to us during this session. And for that, we will use Slido. So now on the screen, you can see the instructions to connect to the Slido. You can either use your phone to scan the QR code or go to a different browser, slido.com, and enter this code, type in MMC when it's asked in the main page. Now, when you enter Slido, you can see that you will have two tabs on the top, where one is for Q&A, so you can drop questions there at any moment. We will try to address some of them. If time allows, we will try to make time for that at the end of the session. But also there's another tab for polls, because we want to ask you a couple of questions as we go. And actually, we will start with one before diving in directly into what is the directive. So I invite you to please, let's go into Slido. And when you get in, you will see this question. So in one or two words, what do you think about when you hear pay transparency? So what's in your mind? Okay, compliance comes big and pay gaps too. We have a little bit about DEI, equality, EU directive. Again, equal pay and pay gaps come big. Reporting, able to check what everyone is paid. Okay, we will talk about that. Fairness, parity, pay equality. So there's, of course, a lot on equity, not just transparency. and gaps, openness, data sharing. Good. Gender pay gap, accountability. Nice. Compliance, definitely. Okay. Good. Thank you for sharing. So, communication. That's another thing that hopefully we will get to, right? How to communicate to employees about this. Honesty, okay. Legality. All right. Thank you very much for sharing this thought. I hope our speakers will look at these words, and let's jump into it right away, and let's start pretty basic. So actually the first question is really, so what's the European Commission's Pay Transparency Directive, right? And how it impacts the EU labor market, countries, and companies. Lucy, would you like to start with it?
Absolutely. So, we can see from this timeline that this is actually not a new idea or thought in the EU. It actually has been evolving over time. So, I have been working in Europe since almost the same time that the directive was in its early stages, maybe a little bit before. In 2019, I started working on pay equity and pay gap reporting in the region. And, it was interesting because each of the different countries had their different legislations with regards to the pay gaps. However, the fact remained was that we still saw that there were these large pay gaps in Europe. And so the Commission, European Commission, was really looking to have a way, a mechanism to reduce this. The gender pay gap currently in Europe sits around 13% according to Eurostat, 11.7 according to other statistics, but you get the point. The men on average are earning, 13% more than women. This was something that the EU wanted to change. And so in 2023, the formal adaptation of the directive went into force. And what this meant was that now member states have to implement this into their law. And this has to occur by June 2026. So countries are actively working on this. We know that some countries are going a little bit, faster on some aspects of the directive, like Poland, where I think you're sitting in terms of recruitment. But if we look at the directive by 2026, we're going to have a situation where the member states need to implement this into law. And we'll talk a little bit about the requirements shortly, but it'll be phased in 2 years. The first in 2026, we'll be looking at individual pay transparency, transparency to recruiting processes, transparency to individual employees in the organization. And from 2027, a bigger impact will be had on the pay gap reporting, which was really the main intent of the EU, to really help organizations and countries to reduce their gender pay gap through being more transparent around pay. And I think we have one more slide, maybe, Eugenia, that illustrates some of the key requirements here. We can see that in 2027, organizations with at least 100 employees by legal entity, and potentially even smaller entities as well, depending on jurisdiction, will need to be reporting out on their pay gaps. And what we see currently in across Europe is that only about 30% of companies are really conducting regular pay equity analyses. So this is quite a big change for companies to consider. It's also important to be able to explain those different objective factors that define pay. And so a lot of work is going on. We can talk about this to look at what are those different objective factors, and where there are risk areas, what are we going to do to close them? So this does go into effect in 2027 in terms of the pay gap reporting, but the data you're going to be reporting on, the companies are going to be reporting on, starts from 2026. So the time is really now to get ahead of this and start to review. And so it's really back to basics, because from next year in June 2026, you're going to be required first and foremost to have a gender neutral job evaluation structure. So this will allow us to ensure that you are comparing work of equal value. We can talk a little bit of that perhaps with Sarah as well. I'm curious to get her perspective. There's also going to be pay transparency for job seekers. So in recruiting activities, you're either going to have information in that job post or be provided to the candidate prior to making that employment offer. And then we need to be able to also explain pay to employees. So employees will have the right to understand their pay today, but also how they progress in the organization. So that career equity is also quite important for companies to consider. And then employees finally will be able to ask for information on the pay, including a breakout by gender, average pay by gender in that same category of worker, however companies are defining it. And the last key element that I'd like to point out is that the definition of pay is not just your salary, it's not just your base pay. This is actually a total remuneration perspective. So it includes any of your allowances, incentives, variable pay of bonuses or long-term incentives or stock options, and then also the benefits. Even non-monetary benefits are coming into play. And here, companies are really looking at their approaches first and foremost to have this data and to report on it, but also to use it in a strategic way to really make a difference in how they're attracting and retaining talent. So the directive, it's very exciting. It's coming quite quickly, but it does have a lot of different requirements, which makes it an exciting journey to go on with the companies that we're working with.
Yeah. Oh wow! I would like to double click in so many things. But Sarah, is there anything that you would like to add on top of this or connect with about the directive in general?
It's a great summary, Lucy. Thank you. I think all I would say is that this applies to all employers in the UK, whether public or private sector. So that's why it's got such a broad remit. And of course, some employers will look at it on a per country basis. Others will try and take a more globalized approach to their workforce when they're looking at putting these job evaluation schemes in place and when they're looking at reporting on their pay gaps. So it's really interesting to see how companies will progress along with this, because even those who are not solely EU employers, so if you've got an organisation that's based out of the EU but employs people in the EU, will be caught as well. Hence why people can be sitting in a variety of countries, but this directive still have a very big impact for them. And there's a lot of work to be done in the run up to June 2026 to be ready for this. I was surprised by the poll we didn't get administrative burden or something like that, as some of the words that might have come to mind as people are thinking of the directive. Is incredibly good news insofar as it's creating a platform to try to improve pay transparency and pay equity. But for those who are actually going to be putting these things in place, it is going to be really burdensome.
Yeah. Going into perhaps more the legal implications of the directive. So you were mentioning not but legally, but the administrative burden, definitely. Which are other challenges that you foresee businesses might have in adapting to these new rules?
Yeah, well, there's a lot really, because as Lucy said, there's a lot to unpick from the directive. So if we start by looking at the obligations when you're advertising roles and you're going through your recruitment process, first of all, you've got to work out what information do you have available about how you determine the pay for that particular role, the pay scale and the pay progression. So looking very much around how the criteria you've used to determine what the pay is for that role and how you then share that. That information has to either be shared in the advert itself, or it's got to be shared before the interview and without the candidate asking for it. So I envisage that for employers that don't want to include too much information in the job advert, there may be a sort of link to our website to see information about how we determine pay for this role, so that employees or candidates for employment can go in and see the information easily without having to actually reach out and ask for it. Employers aren't going to be allowed to ask employees about their salary history anymore. So any policies that you have or practices you have at the moment in place around asking salary history and using that to then determine pay for the job will have to change. Some industries have been quite reliant on salary history in the past, so that could be quite a big change there for them. The other thing around recruitment is you need to have gender neutral recruitment. Now, on one sort of hand, you think, well, surely everyone uses gender neutral recruitment terms or gender neutral job titles. But actually, there's been quite a lot of studies around how certain words in job adverts can be quite off-putting to those of one gender over another. So making sure that your language is as inclusive and neutral as possible will be really important. So that's just the recruitment stage of the process. Then you get into what the obligations are for your existing workforce. And the reporting is very extensive. So as Lucy mentioned, one of the first things you need to look at is who are your categories of workers? And that's not just about saying what job levels do we have, what job titles we have. You're actually having to look much wider to say, where do we see people performing the same roles, or more importantly, work of an equal value? That question of what work is of an equal value is a complex legal one. And there may be various different roles where you wouldn't normally think of work as being of an equal value. In the UK, because we've had gender pay reporting and obviously equal pay legislation for a long time, we've had some quite big cases recently in the retail sector where they've been looking at jobs of an equal value. And there's been findings in the courts, including our highest courts, around roles of people who work in shops being of an equal value to those who work in the distribution centres that then provide the products to go in the shops and then obviously sold onwards. So they're not roles that you would automatically think of as an equal value, but the courts have determined that they are. So there's quite a bit of case law that may be of use or relevance to making that determination as employers go through. But having a job evaluation system in place, and a lot of employers don't currently have one, will be really important to give yourselves the ability to objectively justify how you've categorised this. The objective justification point, again, another legal term, but another legal test that would need to be satisfied. And that basically means being able to objectively say why you're paying a particular wage for a particular role. And that can't be based on gender, of course. So it's got to be based on skill set, it's got to be based on experience, it's got to be based on working conditions, and things that don't go towards anything that could be discriminatory. So again, that's going to be quite a big exercise that will need to be undertaken. The other things to think about, and someone mentioned this on the word cloud, was around communication. So how are you actually going to then communicate on the information to employees? So you've got the obligation to provide information when it's requested, but you've also got your annual gender pay gap report that you will need to do, or 3 times a year if you're a smaller employer. So you'll need to think about how you're going to put that information out in a digestible form that's comprehensive, but yet employees can understand quite easily the information that they've been shared with them. If they don't understand it, inevitably it's going to be resulting in more questions being asked. And for those employers who have got works council representation or trade union representation or other employee representative bodies, those questions are likely to come on a collective level and therefore potentially be much harder to answer or have bigger consequences depending on what your answers are. So there's an awful lot for employers to be really grappling with. And as I say, for June 2026, although it seems a long way away in some senses, when you think about all of the things that you've got to be doing to be in readiness for this, there's a lot to be done.
Mm-hmm. So definitely companies should be getting ready now, right, to get there. Curious about one thing. What could happen to companies that do not report or cannot explain their gaps? Is there anything like that in place?
Yes, there will be. So if a company has a gender pay gap of 5% or more, then it will need to go through a joint pay assessment with its worker representatives to actually be able to explain what is the reason for the gap. Now, if the gap can be objectively justified, as I mentioned before, and or it can't be fixed within 6 months of it being reported, this joint pay assessment process will need to be undertaken. Now, that essentially is going to be opening up the employer's pay systems to the worker representatives to be able to go in together with the employer and actually really dig into the reasons behind the gaps, what can be done to tackle the gaps, what steps will have to be taken going forward. So you can imagine a lot of employers will feel incredibly sensitive about giving the worker groups that kind of level of access to its information. Now, we'll come on to some of the market data stuff later on, but certainly the conversations we've had, most employers feel they'll be able to objectively justify their gaps, but time will tell whether or not they can. And of course, there's also remedies if employers are not able to be, if employers have found not to be conforming with pay transparency obligations under the directive. Those things will include fines, penalties, compensation to employees, paying back pay where they should have been paying them higher. That's going to be determined at a local level. So we'll be waiting local legislation as to what that will actually mean. But essentially, it's going to be significant financial compensation and financial burden for employers who don't conform with the directive.
Okay, clear. So, Lucy, what would you say companies should be doing now?
Yeah. So the time is now to start preparing if you haven't. I think, last year we ran our global Pay Transparency survey. We'll discuss a little bit about the 2025 survey at the end as well. And we found, only about 50% of companies were really starting to get into preparations. When we look at how to prepare, it's important to look at this as a journey. And so that starts with getting a good, solid understanding of where you are as an organization today. And we are typically looking at 5 kind of key areas. So we're looking at your job architecture, how you can really define those category of workers and also explain to employees their work and their ability to progress in their work. Looking at your pay policies, making sure that the recruitment policies are meeting the directive's requirements, being able to explain, what are you paying for as an organization and why are you paying slightly different in different geographies or different business areas? What are you paying for when it comes to your incentive plans? Is it, just discretion or are there solid KPIs behind that? Looking at your current approach to pay equity. So as I mentioned, pay gap reporting was nothing new in Europe. Odds are, if you're a large multinational, you had already many different jurisdictions reporting out on their pay gaps. But how do we now do it in a consistent way in light of the EU and ensure that it is also supporting, the preparations of these annual reports and conversations with the social partners? I think, Sarah, you said that your clients are confident that they're not going to have gaps that trigger 5%. I'm not so sure. I honestly think that this is an ongoing process. And
to be clear, there wasn't that they won't have gaps of 5%, it's that they'll be able to objectively justify those gaps. I think we've already seen, as you rightly say, gaps well exceeding 5% on gender pay, but the objective justification is going to be the trigger for the assessment.
Exactly. So being able to objectively explain that, but even then, there might be cases that take time to remediate. Sometimes we see that there are large gaps, and it simply takes time to close that. I think one of the interesting statistics that we have from some of our research is fair pay is the number 2 reason that employees stay in the organization. The only thing above that is job security. So how do we balance, the financial security of organizations with that fair pay? So that really does get into that social partner discussions as well. Then the fourth element that we need to look at are the benefits and the pay, just the data that's required. It's a great opportunity for organizations to get their house in order as well. There's many efficiencies that can come through from having solid employee databases. We were talking about the future of compensation earlier, Eugenia, if you recall, and using this data effectively, I think will become much more important in the future. And then finally, the change in communications aspects, which came through on that word cloud. There's so many different stakeholders to consider. So, when we look at the directive, we need to look at the leadership and get them engaged. We need to look at our HR team and make sure that they're prepared to support the organizations, the managers to have conversations to the employees themselves that have the rights to request information. And then finally, the social partners and external candidates or even investors will soon become important to speak to. So having a good handle of these 5 pillars, the job architecture, your pay policies, your data around pay and benefits, your approach to pay equity and broader change in communications, and then creating this roadmap, allowing everyone in the organization to help out in their own way, but moving in the same direction, I think is the next kind of challenge that organizations are going through right now. It's definitely a situation where we're making decisions and we're planning without having all the answers with regards to the country legislation, with regards to market practice. But it is it is evolving. And, when we look at the financial service industry in particular, there have been other legislations and requirements due to the kind of banking industry in particular that mean that your organizations might be further along in some areas, but maybe are lagging in others. So having that readiness assessment, understanding where to prioritize, I think is a really key first step.
Okay. Great points. We are going to move into readiness in a second, but there's one other question. Perhaps, Sarah, you can take it, that it's regarding, every EU member state is going to make their legislation based on the directive. Now, how can employers ensure consistency, like consistent application across all the states where they operate to, right? Considering that there might be potential variations depending on the countries. Any take on that?
Yeah, it's a great question because unfortunately, until the member states all publish their own individual bits of legislation, it's going to be hard to see where the consistencies are. Now, of course, they've all got to be compliant with the directive. What we don't know is, though, how they will perhaps build upon what's in the directive or where the directive isn't entirely clear how they're going to interpret that. So a number of our clients are trying to take a uniform approach at the moment in getting ready for the directive, but then they'll have to then have an overlay with local law to be able to say, well, actually, what more do we need to do here to ensure that we are consistent locally? And that is just an extra layer of burden again, because you want to be able to say, well, actually, this is all about fairness. It's all about fairness across our workforce. It's not about treating somebody better because they're in this country or giving them more information because they're in this country versus this country. So what you may see is sort of levelling up and say, well, okay, we'll look at whichever country's got the most onerous obligations and we'll do the same for everybody across the board, because again, administratively that might be easier, but then you may be creating more obligation for yourself in certain countries. So there's going to be a little bit of a wait and see approach, but I think at the moment you can at least start your planning, start your preparation based on what the directive gives us, with a bit of interpretation that's coming through from some of the countries that are a little bit ahead of the game than others.
Yeah, I would say, just adding on, Eugene, if you don't mind, we have many clients that are operating cross-border and, they have teams that are cross-border. So, my manager might be sitting in the UK. What does this mean? Does he not have the same, rights and opportunities for transparency because of, being in the UK versus in Europe? But if we look at, the minimum standards and, the the preparations, I agree, Sarah. It is, a desire, I think, to have more consistency because that does lead to more efficiency and productivity in the organization. So that is definitely an end state goal for many of the clients that we're working on.
Yeah. Okay, so we mentioned readiness assessment already. Lucy, you share a little bit about what we've seen in the industry in particular, like right with regulations already in place that is helping perhaps the insurance, reinsurance industry, banking and financial to be a little bit ahead in comparison to the general market, right? Anything else you would like to highlight about that? And then I would like to hear also from you, Sarah, because I know Sherman also ran a study about readiness. So it would be nice to listen about your findings. Lucy, you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the industry, you're right that we do see more kind of leaders in this space. I think that, in terms of equity in particular, it has been a focus for many years for global financial institutions. And the caveat is, even if we've been doing something for many years, we still need to look at it in the light of the EU. So it's not to say there's still not this administrative burden or kind of requirements to be reviewing things in terms of these new requirements. And then I think that the area that we are seeing perhaps a little bit of differentiation right now is also this focus on the change in the communications aspects, and really looking into how the organizations can effectively bring this to the different stakeholders through different multimedia initiatives, understanding that perhaps having even different avatars or visual imagery to support this campaigns are going to make the difference. So I think that is a step that we've seen starting to emerge really in the last, I would say, 3 months, that I anticipate really picks up speed as we gear into 2026.
Okay. Sarah, will you share with us some highlights or the outcomes of your study about readiness?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Apologies, I was looking down at some of the stats just because I want to get them right rather than from memory. But this was a study we did across a number of our EU clients, so across sectors, but tend to be very large corporates within the EU member states. So sort of bear that in mind when you hear some of the stats that we've got. Interestingly and rather reassuringly, nearly everyone who responded to it was aware of the fact that they would need to have a job evaluation methodology in place. So that's a good thing. Awareness at least is there. However, it doesn't go much further beyond awareness, unfortunately. Only 4% of the people we spoke to, so 4%, had already reported full alignment with that methodology system. So that's a really small proportion of the overall pot. About half of what was left of the respondents said that they believe that their methodology that's in place already is going to be sufficient, which I think is optimistic. But there's probably a bit more work for them to be done in terms of really aligning how they've evaluated a job based on gender neutral criteria, and just being able to really think carefully about this concept of equal work and whether they're comparing the right jobs with the right jobs. The other half of those who replied said that they were in the process of developing the methodology. So encouraging, but probably need to push forward with that a little bit quicker. And I hasten to say, employers across Europe have, of course, been juggling with a number of issues just purely on the employment side, let alone more widely across the economy. But there's been a lot of change. So this is just another thing to be adding to what they're already grappling with, which is why I think probably so many of them haven't actually progressed as far as perhaps they should have done. When we look at the job descriptions and the approach that they've already made to aligning their job descriptions with the requirements of the directive, again, only 4% of them, which was the same as the previous 4%, have fully reviewed and updated all of their job descriptions to reflect the requirements of the directive. So 45% are currently doing it, and some have made partial updates to them. Again, I think that's a point which actually could be progressed relatively quickly, in the sense that you can actually do some work on your job recruitment processes around gender neutrality, around how you're going to actually communicate the information that you've got available, and make that available to candidates. So there's some sort of quick win decisions, I would say, on some of these things that mean that you can then focus on some of the bigger picture things later on. Just turn to another stat that we had when we were looking at gender pay gap assessments. 39% haven't yet analysed their gender pay gaps, but obviously are planning to do so by the time of the deadline. But that's, again, a big proportion, because if you're starting to do a bit of a dry run now of what your gender pay gap is, it allows you to start thinking about, where do we have a problem? Where do we have this 5% that Lucy and I have referred to earlier? And where you identify your 5%, can you objectively justify that? What criteria are you using to be able to reach that justification? If you can't, you've got some time to try to work on it, or you've got time to remedy it, of course, more importantly, before you get into this joint pay assessment process. So it is quite imperative that people are starting to do some of these dry runs so they can work out the extent of the problems that they may have. So I don't think we were surprised by the findings, in the sense that from conversations and advice we've been giving to clients, over the past significant period of time. We knew that clients were a bit behind the curve, but I don't think we realised that perhaps they were quite so behind the curve. The one other stat I'll leave you with, which is probably surprising from a Mercer perspective anyway, is that a number of our clients are looking to do this in-house and not rely on external support to get themselves compliant. You'll be pleased to know that we have stressed to them that we think it's important to get that external support, because you guys are the experts on these things. You've got the legal overlay, of course, but you need the remuneration consultancy advice to be able to come in and really help to strength test this. So interesting to see if we rerun that stat again in a couple of months' time, whether we now see more clients are taking external advice, particularly as the deadline gets closer.
Great. Okay. We got a question there that before we go into that, I would like to open a new poll that I don't know if you are seeing the Slido details again. If not, there we go. So you can scan the QR code if you missed the page, or go to slido.com and put the code in. You've been hearing for the last half an hour about the directive, but still, how do you consider your level of understanding of the directive right now? Some high-level details, very little. Are you actively involved actually in working on this in your company, or do you know more in detail?
Yeah, I think that this is similar to what we see with our clients. There's some days that I have to remind myself that not everyone walks around with a directive like a Bible, and that, this is a new concept, but I think that this does show that, yes, there is awareness and it's growing, but absolutely we need to be looking and sharing more information with other stakeholders, because it's not just a compensation and benefits activity. It's not just a legal activity, Sarah. There's so many other stakeholders that we need to be working with.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your answers. And actually, I take the chance to remind you, you can leave your questions there in Slido as well, in the Q&A section. And talking about, okay, so I'm familiar with some high-level details. I'm going to take a question from the audience right away, because it will help us to open some other area that is connected to employees, actually. So someone is asking, how can I prepare as an employee to ensure I know my rights? So talking about how much they know or not. What can we say regarding that?
Sarah, you want to start from a legal perspective and then I can add on?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So, as an employee, you're going to be able to ask your employer some pretty direct questions about how your pay has been calculated, what your pay scale is, what your pay progression is, what criteria they have used to be able to make the assessment of your pay, but also how you're comparing or how they are comparing, sorry, your pay with that of people doing equal work. So who are these people? Who are these comparators that your employer considers doing equal work? And of course, if you don't agree with that, you'll be able to challenge it as well. So, the power, there is a bit of a power shift in all of this actually to employees, which is all, of course, part of transparency, but also giving this legislation some actual teeth, because if all the employer's got to do is put out a stat and that's the end of it, then really that isn't going to take employees much further. Whereas in this situation, of course, employees can dig a lot deeper. And if you have a collective worker representative body, whether that be Works Council, trade union, etc., being able to ask those questions through your representative body will also give you a lot more power to be able to really challenge the answers you're being given or to seek further information. So I think for employees who are interested to know more, there will be more to find out.
And then I guess also as an employee, you're also potentially a candidate. So, with the job postings, making sure that you have access to that range before providing, any sort of expectations on your part, not sharing your previous pay levels will also become, a right that you have. And, it will be a difficult, I would say, transition for some companies and some recruiters to adhere to that requirement as well.
Yes, but this will definitely change the way we negotiate salaries, right? Like there will be a lot of more actual data to be discussed, right? And not just perceptions or, yeah.
And then I would say, we have data that says candidates won't even apply to jobs if information is not provided clearly. So the flip side to that is that this can actually improve business efficiencies if we are being more proactive and specific on what we are going to be paying for these different positions. Then we will get access to better candidates, more targeted candidates, and speed up that recruitment process potentially.
Yeah. Got it. I will take another question from the audience. We can connect perhaps with the Global Pay Transparency Survey that we are currently running. And perhaps, Lucy, you can share highlights from the last edition. Actually, the question is, will market data be an objective justification to pay one category more than another, meaning actuaries earning more than underwriters at same level? So I guess comparing jobs. The question is if market data can be used or as an explanation or justification for the different pay.
Yeah, I mean, it can be, but you need to be very clear that it is accurate. Quite often, you'll have market data being used as a rationale, but when you actually dig deeper into that market data, either it won't support the position you're trying to adopt as an employer, or actually you may find there is some gender bias in there anyway, which could be a historic position that's been allowed to continue or otherwise. So it's important that you're not just using that as the sole factor, that you've really tested it properly, and that you've really then considered internally within your own organisation, because that's the key point. What are the skills that you're rating people against? What are the skills you're using? What are the working conditions, the experience that people have got? So it's informative, but it's not going to be on its own enough to get you over the hurdle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we know companies need to be aligned with the market. They need to be able to attract and retain their talent and pay competitively to do that. But this directive now requires also a very big focus on that internal perspective. And so being sure that you're able to look at those, positions and understand the work of equal value with the criteria that's in the directive. And use that to really also shape your rewards policies and practices will become more important. The other kind of lens will be around the gender perspective, and you mentioned the bias in data. But also in rewards decisions. So when we're hiring or giving promotions or merit pay increases, have we looked at this from that gender perspective? Have we made sure that that policy is really focused on providing equal opportunities?
Mm-hmm. Good. Can you provide any examples of what companies are doing as they get ready? Any good cases of actions or like different things to the standard ones, or any case you would like to share as an example? Any of you, Lucy, would you?
Yeah, I think with my European perspective, it's really fun to see companies from all different parts of the world and how they're preparing. I think that we see here in Italy, there's definitely this Italian perspective that's very different than the German perspective, and we see in Ireland the same. So each country has kind of the home country mentality that slowly but surely is beginning to kind of evolve in the EU standard. I think in terms of best practice, the biggest challenge that we see is that companies get stuck with making decisions because they don't have all the clarity, and that's also where market practice can help to reassure them. So looking at the readiness assessment, we know that half of companies are working actively on this in this year. We're running again our global pay transparency survey, where we're going a little bit deeper around what are companies actually planning to share when it comes to compensation, both internally and externally. How are we going to be setting up our pay bands, and what are we going to be sharing for the recruitment perspective? So I think it's using market data to help guide, and using assumptions and then testing them is a really big best practice that we see. There are countries that are going faster, like Poland with recruitment, and this is an opportunity to maybe prioritize smaller parts of that workforce and pilot and learn, and then evolve. And then the other kind of key consideration is that education component. And we saw in our poll that we just ran that 50% really didn't have so much information around the directive. We need to start to share information, even if we don't have all the answers. We need to let them know that this is coming, and that we're preparing, and that we're going to have different procedures and policies that will need to be adhered to in the future to help with that change momentum. And Sarah, from your perspective.
Yeah, I think some of the more unique, perhaps, ways that we've seen some of our clients approach it, and obviously I need to be generic in terms of how I answer the question, but some of them are being very actively engaging with their workforces and their worker representation bodies as they're going through the planning stage. So testing the comms piece, for example, and saying, is this level of information you think people want to have? Do you think there's areas where people might want to understand a bit more? Is the way that we're communicating, explaining it clear enough? Are we putting it on the right forums to be able to get the information out to people? So already kind of getting buy-in from employees through the worker representation bodies to try to then hopefully mitigate or reduce the number of people that may come forward later on when it becomes law and says, actually, I don't like this, or I don't agree with this. And so that can be quite powerful, because actually you're already firstly, getting a message out to people who perhaps don't know very much about the directive and what's going to be involved in it and what their own rights will be. But secondly, as I say, getting ahead of any complaints that may come up later on down the line as well. So not everyone's doing it that way, I hasten to say, but it is certainly you know, a collaborative way of moving forward.
Great. One of the questions that we had, briefly, perhaps Sarah, you can comment on that. The UK has had gender pay gap reporting for a while. So how has this helped with pay transparency as well as correcting equal pay issues?
It hasn't really, in my view. I mean, the UK's gender pay gap obligations are minimal in comparison to what the Pay Transparency Directive requires. So just very briefly, UK gender pay gap reporting is just about saying this is what our average pay gap is between men and women in our organisation, broken down into sort of 4 quartiles, representing your highest down to your lowest earners. And so from that, you would be able to see that men who are in your quartile are paid the same, less or more than you, and you can identify what the gap is. But what it doesn't really tell you, of course, is, well, how much do I earn in comparison to the man who sits next to me or to a man who's doing a similar job to me? And that's, you know, where the directive goes so much further, because you're actually going to be comparing apples with apples as opposed to potentially apples with all sorts of other fruit as you do in the UK obligation. So I think the best thing that can be said about the current UK regime is that it prompts discussion. And you know, it prompts discussion around what companies are doing to try to improve gender pay gap more widely and what initiatives they have in place to try to improve, you know, female representation in the workplace and similar things around inclusion. But as I say, the directive is going to be such a step up from that, both in terms of how pay is reported, but also the other steps we've talked about through recruitment and through individual information. What is interesting, though, is the UK government is currently deciding whether it should introduce comparable provisions to that of those of the directive, because of course we're not covered by the directive anymore. So it'll be interesting to see whether the UK government does decide to do some kind of mirroring of the directive. And we've also got quite a lot of employment law changes coming up in the next 12 to 18 months, some of which will include or potentially include race reporting, so rather than gender pay gap reporting, race pay gap reporting, and as well as disability pay gap reporting. So there's certainly a continued movement in the UK to have more clarity over pay. Whether we go as far as the directive or not, I don't know. But as I mentioned at the very outset, if you're a UK employer and you have more than 100 people in an EU member state, you're still caught by this. And as I think Lucy mentioned, you know, if you've got people working across jurisdictions, which of course so many people do in this world, people are going to be expecting the same level of information irrespective of which country they're working in. And simply saying, well, we don't have to tell you that in this country is not really a great employee relations answer. So I think employers inevitably are going to find themselves in situations where they engage more in discussion around how they're paying their global workforces.
Yeah, I think last year in our Pay Transparency survey, we saw, 25% of companies want to have this global strategy. And, I think when it comes to the directive, so often we think it has to be all or nothing. But the reality is article by article, companies can go through and decide, okay, well, what are we going to look at, regionally? What are we going to look at country by country? And what do we actually want to pull up and execute on a global basis? The US, I think is also a good example, because here we had pay transparency legislation that went into effect state by state. And it was really when companies hit that 60% threshold of populations that, they started to look at things more consistency. Again, having more efficiencies in their operations, having also the ability to drive that employee engagement. So I think we focus so much on the risk aspect of the directive. We also need to think about, some of those kind of positive outcomes that also can occur in terms of our employer brand, in terms of our ability to attract and retain, talent in the organization and drive more productivity.
Yeah, definitely. Those are some of the benefits, right, of this on top of course, equity and so on. I have one question that it's connected actually a bit with GDPR. If there are only few people in a category, in a job, in a company, will they be able to ask for average pay details? So how does that sit with GDPR? For example, we know there's only one female or male, right? How can the company give information about it without disclosing like specific of an individual? Is there any take on that? Any definition?
Great question. Everyone, in all respects, it always comes back to the GDPR, doesn't it? But no, it's a great question. I think, again, this is going to be something we're going to see more playing out at local level in terms of how local each member state has locally interpreted and implemented GDPR alongside then how it will manage the directive. On the face of the directive, you have to report your categories, whether you've got 1 or 101 people in there. Now, obviously, you have to think about how you're drawing up your categories. You might be able to draw them up in a way that doesn't identify one person over others, and that might be a way to sort of avoid the pitfalls of GDPR. But it would just be interesting to see how that actually manifests itself locally. And you can imagine that we have it, at the moment when, with equal pay legislation as it currently is in member states, where people can say, I want to compare myself in a court with my pay compared to the person who sits next to me or 3 offices down from me, and then getting disclosure of that person's information in legal proceedings, whether that person likes it or not. That would be an exemption in any event. So it will be interesting to see how that then plays out in a more wider reporting obligation.
Yeah, good. So the directive is not yet, let's say, working in the legislation, but we have a question about further future. So let's get creative, or you can say there's nothing on it. The question is about what are the next steps beyond the directive? Like, can we expect future even stricter legislation at the EU level with all of this? So kind of what's the direction, right? We are going here. What might be next?
Well, I guess from kind of looking forwards, the kind of things that I envisage could come up is in relation to how this is enforced. So we talked a bit before about that being a matter for local member states in terms of compensation, fines, etc. But what you could find actually is national bodies, particularly public sector bodies, saying we are not going to do business with people who are reporting gaps of a certain level who are not taking proactive steps to reduce those levels. So there's sort of being a carrot and stick approach to enforcement. So it actually hits business as well as employee talent and retention. I mentioned obviously the UK branching out beyond gender into race and disability reporting. Depending on how the Pay Transparency Directive goes from a gender perspective, you can see that also being something that's built in more widely. I mean, obviously, a number of European countries already have quotas around the employment of disabled people, for example. So you could see an extension for transparency in those regards. So I don't imagine we're going to have a huge amount changing very soon after the directive coming in, because it's been a lot to do. And I think time will tell how effective it is about actually changing the gap and creating better transparency. But you can envisage in a sort of longer term there being a bit more creativity applied to the enforcement of it and the extent of it.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for this. And actually, we are getting to the hour. Amazing. It's been so interesting and informative. Any final words from you? Anything that perhaps we didn't mention and you would like to say in regards to the topic or anything? Not really. We really talked about so much.
You did, and
Yes.
it's a topic that I think I could go on for, 3 hours, 4 hours, a whole dinner. The good news is, we do have lots of conversations on this topic. I was saying earlier, this is my second webinar today, right? But in the local countries, we have different events all the time. So if you're looking for more resources, don't hesitate to reach out, and we're happy to have a conversation with you. And I think Eugenia will also be sharing some of our, survey material, readiness assessment materials as well, in case that's of interest.
Yes, thank you. Anything from you, Sarah? And we can close.
I mean, I hope that if we were to redo the word cloud now, people would feel either a bit more positive about what this is going to bring as an employee. You'd feel it's good news that there's going to be greater transparency. And hopefully for those who are looking at this through the employer lens, we haven't scared you too much about the work involved in implementing this.
Super. Big thanks to both of you. It's been amazing to listen to you and all this knowledge and all this experience. So thanks very, very much. And thank you to everyone that stayed with us this hour. We really hope you learned a lot. And yes, we can stay in touch. Thanks a lot. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.